Alrighty, let's introduce you to some of our bacterial bad guys. These are the usual suspects, the ones you're most likely to run into when it comes to cooking food in your kitchen or actually eating food in restaurants, as luck would have it. Yay. So, our first public enemy, number one, is salmonella. And everybody's heard of this. It's naturally found in farm animals. This is actually like a really common bacteria in farms. But the problem is when we run into like large farming operations or poorly managed food industrial companies, the salmonella that's already present in the farm animals can easily contaminate the meat from those farm animals as well as other foods. So, some of the common carriers for salmonella, or some of the common things you might find salmonella in, are eggs, poultry, meats, dairy products, processed greens like bagged greens. And here's the thing, right? Salmonella doesn't naturally show up on greens, but cross contamination is a real problem, especially like if the greens have been washed in water that's been contaminated with salmonella or it's been cross contaminated in some other way. Now, the one of the most common ways to spread salmonella, and this is a problem in restaurants particularly, but it can happen in your home too, is that salmonella is easily spread by people who have the illness, because what happens is they get sick and they go to the restroom and they don't properly wash their hands afterwards, and then they go and they cook some food, and then the person that eats that food ends up contracting salmonella. So salmonella prevention is actually really easy, right? So salmonella does not like to grow outside of the danger zone. So if you have food with a little bit of salmonella on it, it's fine. Like, you'd never know it because you're going to cook that food and that salmonella is going to die, right? And if you keep it properly refrigerated, the salmonella that's already present in that food will not really proliferate. It'll just stay at a manageable number and then it will die off when you cook it. No big deal, no harm, no foul. You want to make sure that you cook meat and eggs to a safe temperature. It's really important, and I'll explain in the second slide for each of these bacteria what that temperature is. But cooking, just remember that in general, you want to cook meat and eggs to a federally recommended safe temperature. And there's a cheat sheet attached to this module that you will find that has the safe cooking temperatures for all sorts of different foods. Another really important factor when it comes to salmonella prevention is not eating raw eggs. And I know, like, there's actually a community of people out there that eat raw eggs. And you know what? If you're eating raw eggs and they're your chickens, like, take the risk. It's totally your personal choice. But as the one responsible for your cooking, sanitation, education, I have to tell you, never eat raw eggs. You can buy pasteurized eggs, right? Which are great. Still, do not get into the habit of eating raw eggs, because even pasteurized eggs like have some degree of potential contamination. And a lot of people just like to use pasteurized eggs for cooking, especially if you're using like egg yolks or, you know, raw eggs for things that the egg might not get cooked completely. Like if you're making a carbonara, a lot of people like to throw a raw egg in their smoothies for protein. If you're doing that, like, I hope you're using pasteurized eggs. And even if you are using pasteurized eggs, there's still a certain degree of risk that you're taking on. And that's why when you see stuff like carbonara in a restaurant, it's got a little disclaimer that says, you know, you're taking on risk by eating this because the egg is, you know, potentially not fully cooked to full temperature to kill all bacteria. So, but I also say that as a person who loves carbonara. So make your own personal choice, just be smart. The next way to prevent salmonella is to eat meat, eggs, and produce from reputable sources. Like, you run into a lot of trouble with large companies that have poor like policies and they're not watching their plants very well. And when I say plants, I mean like their factories. You know, you got these huge operations and contamination is a problem because there's so many people working and maybe the company and management are not watching like they should, and they do not have the protocols in place to make sure that the food is being regularly tested and documented every step of the way. These are actually requirements by the USDA. The problem is that, you know, some of these companies are so huge that they can fudge them a little bit and they don't get caught until it's too late. And then you hear about like these horrible, huge outbreaks or food recalls, like the whole bagged spinach thing with salmonella, right? That was a real problem. Generally, you want to keep an eye on like ready to eat foods and keep them away from anything that may contain salmonella, because the problem is if you like cross contaminate a ready to eat food with salmonella, you're not going to cook it before you eat it, right? And again, I'm talking like potato salad, raw vegetables, raw fruit, right? Ready to eat foods are a really common place to contract salmonella because the salmonella bacteria has spread from something that's contaminated to the ready to eat food, the potato salad, the sandwich, the salad bar, the whatever it is. And since it was not cooked, the salmonella was not killed before somebody ate it. You always want to wash your hands really, really well before eating or preparing food. Like we just went over how to like wash your hands like very carefully and very, very safely. So you always want to wash your hands before and after handling foods that may have been contaminated with salmonella, so chicken, eggs, that sort of thing. And you also always want to fully wash your hands before handling any foods at all, really, but specifically ready to eat foods. Like your hands need to be basically super sanitized before handling anything that is not going to be cooked before it is eaten. You want to disinfect surfaces and tools after preparing at-risk foods. Again, that's like chicken, eggs, meat, that sort of thing. But even veggies can be contaminated, right? Like that whole bagged spinach salmonella debacle was a total nightmare, you know? So you have to be really careful about disinfecting your surfaces and tools when preparing foods, just to make sure there's no cross-contamination between like prepared foods and foods that are, you know, not going to be cooked before you eat them. Using separate cutting boards for meat and produce is a really great idea here. Like if you're cutting chicken, and then even if you scrub the holy hell out of that cutting board, if you were to cut vegetables on it, if you missed a spot and there was salmonella on that chicken, on that raw chicken, then you could contaminate your vegetables. It's just not worth the risk. So always make sure to separate cutting boards from meat and produce. This is actually really easy. Cutting boards are cheap. It's not even, you know, a factor. You can get a cutting board for like $4 at Target. So just do it. And finally, don't prepare food if you've been recently diagnosed with salmonella or if you have any sort of foodborne illness or any major digestive upset, because odds are you may have contracted some form of food poisoning, and humans can shed salmonella in their poop for weeks after you've recovered. So, I mean, it's like 2-3 weeks and you're still shedding this in your, yeah. So salmonella can be killed, thank God. Salmonella dies when food or whatever it's in is heated to 160 degrees Fahrenheit or 71 degrees centigrade. You can cook it to lower temperatures for a longer period of time, but the problem is that period of time varies wildly based on the percentage of fat of the food in question. You'll see like a little link down here if you want more information. But you'll hear people say, well, I cooked it to 150 degrees for 30 minutes, therefore it's safe. And that's potentially true, but you need to be spot on your science to know whether or not it's absolutely accurate, because the difference between like beef and chicken, given that one is fattier than the other, like the amount of time you would have to hold that food at 150 degrees varies wildly. So you're better off just cooking your food to 160 degrees to avoid salmonella contamination. If you want to get really nerdy on it, like I provided the link, but again, you're taking risk on yourself if you don't cook something to 160 degrees. Our next little public enemy is one you may not have heard the name of, but a lot of people contract it. It's called Shigella. And actually, you end up contracting shigellosis from Shigella, and it's a really unpleasant form of food poisoning, and it's passed around only through poor restroom cleanliness, which means if you've contracted Shigella, that means you had poop in your food at some point, and it's really gross. Again, wash your hands and eat at restaurants where you're pretty sure that the people are like the management is making sure that the staff is washing their hands, because it's a big deal. It is almost always caused by a cook's poor hygiene. Now, Shigella is found in ready-to-eat food that's been contaminated, like salad bars, raw vegetables, like those cold delis where they scoop food and drop it into like a little deli dish to give to you. And another problem is prepared foods are particularly susceptible because they're not cooked before you eat them. So if you're, you know, handling contaminated food or something that's been contaminated, and then you handle potato salad and then you eat that potato salad or serve it to someone else, like, congratulations, like Shigella is now a problem in your purview. So like potato salad is a problem, macaroni salad, lunch meat, anything that is eaten before it is cooked is susceptible. And if you really think about it, there's a lot of foods that are eaten raw, right? Like fruit, green salads, spinach greens, raw fish, like, you know, it's, you got to be super careful to wash your hands before cooking. And this is one of the primary reasons why. Now, another reason that Shigella can be transmitted is because it's in contaminated ice and water, right? So if you drink contaminated water, you'll get sick. Freezing does not kill it, so contaminated ice is still a problem. And then you run into the added bonus of anything that's been in contact with that contaminated water is also contaminated. So say you have a salad and the veggies have been washed in contaminated water that's got Shigella in it. Congratulations, you are now sick. And this is actually one of the common causes of, Delhi belly or Montezuma's revenge, or like your travel diarrhea of choice, right? Is washing, foods that you're about to eat in contaminated water from other countries and then eating the food that hasn't been cooked. So it's actually one of the reasons why they say when you're traveling in areas that are highly prone to like digestive upset that you don't generally want to eat fresh vegetables that have not been peeled, right? So basically salads are off the table, unfortunately. And as always, like food that's been prepared by people who have the illness, like are exponentially more likely to be contaminated because that's just the way it is. That's how Shigella spreads. You go to the bathroom, you get poop on your hands, you didn't wash it well enough, and then, yeah, you know how the story goes. Thankfully, preventing Shigella is super easy. So first and foremost, you want to refrigerate foods properly. So say you buy some food and you inadvertently bought food that has a little bit of Shigella bacteria in it. So it's not necessarily a big deal, right? Because there needs to be bacteria in high enough numbers to actually make you sick. So a little tiny, tiny, tiny bit of Shigella in your food may not be a bad thing, assuming the food is refrigerated as soon as you get it home to keep it out of the danger zone, right? So remember, bacteria loves to proliferate in the danger zone, right? So if you keep it refrigerated or if you keep it over 135 degrees, you drastically reduce the speed at which bacteria multiplies, reducing the chances of you getting sick. Another really important factor is washing food in untreated or unsterilized water. We talked about this briefly, like if you're in a country where they don't have great like municipal water sanitation and whoever's making your food has washed the salad greens in contaminated water and then you eat the salad, like you're going to get sick, right? So this is actually a big factor that you want to keep an eye on. You want to make sure you wash your hands really well before eating or preparing food, regardless. This is just a rule. Like number one, like wash your hands, right? It just controls so many different things. And you also want to control the flies in and around your eating and food prep areas because, flies are nasty. They land on something gross and then they land on your dinner, like if you're having a picnic. So you want to get rid of them and make sure that they're not landing on your food because flies can actually carry all sorts of unsavory, nasty things. Blech. You want to avoid drinking untreated or unsterilized water, and that includes ice because freezing does not kill Shigella. So when you're in a place where the water is not necessarily clean, you need to be super mindful of the water that you're drinking. You want to disinfect surfaces and tools after prepping at-risk foods, which is pretty much anything, right? Because Shigella can end up in anything that you're eating. So it's a really good argument for always washing your tools and surfaces between preparing different foods. Do not prepare food if you've been recently diagnosed with Shigella or you've got some sort of like digestive upset that's been happening recently, because if you do have Shigella, you will shed that nastiness in your poop for weeks after you feel better. So you just need to be super mindful of like not preparing food if you've been recently very sick. Thankfully, killing Shigella is super easy. Cook food to 160 degrees Fahrenheit or 71 degrees centigrade and bam, it is dead. Now, like salmonella, you can cook food to lower temperatures for a longer period of time and still kill the bacteria. But I'm going to remind you again, because this is super important, that the period of time varies depending on the food in question, how much fat it is, like in a bunch of different factors. So you're safest cooking food to 160 degrees Fahrenheit if you want to make sure that you kill all the Shigella in your food. Now, here's one we've probably all heard of, and it's E. coli. So here's the interesting thing about E. coli. Like E. coli, as the bacteria, doesn't actually make you sick. What makes you sick is the Shiga toxin that is produced by the E. coli bacteria. If you get the Shiga toxin in your system, you're going to get super sick. Now, this bacteria lives naturally in the gut of farm animals, therefore contaminating meat products in factories and slaughterhouses that are not properly maintained and managed to FDA and USDA standards. It's also found in contaminated drinking water and water used for watering crops. So when you see E. coli ending up on vegetables, like bagged spinach and whatnot, that's a potential cause of it because the crops have been watered with E. coli contaminated water, and then they weren't properly sanitized before it went out to the public. And then again, it can be spread by poor restroom hygiene. Blech. E. coli is most commonly found in undercooked meat, especially ground meat. And now ground meat is particularly vulnerable, and there's a reason for that. So I explained earlier that bacteria lives on the surface of a cut of meat, right? So you have a steak, like the bacteria, if it's contaminated, is on the surface of that steak and not generally in the middle of it. But the problem with ground meat is you basically take, a bunch of cuts of meat and you throw them in an enormous meat grinder with like the meat from like 1,000 cows, and all that surface is no longer existent, right? All the bacteria that was on the surface of that meat was like now mixed into all of this like huge batch of ground meat. And it becomes doubly a problem because if you were like grinding like one steak, right, like you're only worrying about the contamination from one cow. But if you're eating commercially ground meat, like there's no telling how many animals are in that, meat grinder at one time. And therefore, it increases the chances of contamination because it's many, many, many animals contributing to one batch of meat at once. Now, contaminated ice and water are another problem, right? Anything that's been in contact with contaminated water is at risk. That includes raw veggies, that includes raw fruit, salad greens. I keep saying salad greens are like the unfortunate, redheaded stepchild when it comes to E. coli, because it gets on them and then they're not cooked before you eat them, and then you get very sick. And food that's been cross-contaminated and not cooked before eating isn't just salad greens, right? It includes prepared foods like potato salad, tuna salad, chicken salad, anything that you would eat raw, like, cold salads, fresh produce, raw carrots. And food that is prepared by people who have the illness is particularly risky because they went to the restroom, they didn't wash their hands properly, they prepared the food, and now it's in your food. E. coli prevention, super easy, just like pretty much everything else, right? Refrigerate all chilled foods promptly after buying. You want to eat meat from reputable sources that make sure that their plants and factories are up to code. They're following government guidelines for cleanliness. They're regularly testing the food that they're producing, and they've got documentation. So when something does go wrong, they know exactly where it happened and how to fix it and what to recall so the public knows how to avoid getting sick. You always want to cook meat to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. You want to grind your own meat at home. Remember, we all just talked about, ground meat and why throwing 1,000, different cuts of meat into a meat grinder can increase your risk of developing E. coli. You don't want to wash food in untreated or unsterilized water. You want to wash your hands well before eating or preparing foods, and you want to control flies around your eating and food prep areas. You also want to avoid drinking untreated or unsterilized water. And again, that includes the ice because freezing does not kill E. coli. You want to disinfect surfaces and tools after preparing foods to make sure there's no cross-contamination between what you're producing now and what you're producing in the future. You want to use separate cutting boards for meat and produce. So if you are cutting a steak or chicken or something that has E. coli on it, therefore, when you cook it, it's going to kill off that bacteria. But, if you were to prepare carrots on that same cutting board, even if you think you disinfected it, you might not have gotten all of it. So it's just safer to use separate cutting boards. Do not prepare food if you've been diagnosed with E. coli in recent weeks or you've recently had some sort of major digestive upset. Because if you have contracted E. coli, you are going to potentially shed that for weeks and weeks and weeks after you've recovered. So just because you feel better does not mean you're not still shedding it in your, And finally, E. coli is killed by heating food to 160 degrees Fahrenheit or 71 degrees Celsius. So this is like the magic temperature, right? This kills E. coli, it kills Shigella, it kills Salmonella, it kills a lot of other things. So if you're cooking food for at-risk populations, children, the elderly, people that have been sick, pregnant women, 160 degrees is always the temperature you want to reach minimum. And of course, you want to shoot for this temperature as well when you're cooking for yourself. But when you're cooking for people that are have a compromised immune system or compromised health, this number needs to be etched into your brain. Now, I'm going to spare you the symptoms of all these slides because you know exactly what food poisoning feels like, but I encourage you to download the attached chart with symptoms so you can see the details on each of these little monsters.